Does anyone actually love me? Or do they love my money or what I can do for them? Hear my story.
He wiped the same glass door every single night, long after everyone else had gone home, watching his own reflection fade into the darkness of a building he secretly owned. And the only person who ever spoke to him in that silence had no idea she was walking past a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a man who had built everything she stepped into each morning, and yet chose to stand in front of her as someone invisible, because the last time he showed the world who he really was. It cost him more than money. It cost him trust. And this time he was willing to risk everything just to find out one thing, whether someone could truly love him when there was nothing to gain. And what he didn't realize yet was that the answer he was searching for would force him to confront a truth far more uncomfortable than anything his past had prepared him for. His name was Daniel Brooks, a self-made entrepreneur from Chicago who had spent 2 decades building a logistics empire that quietly powered supply chains across the United States. A man whose companies touched everything from retail to manufacturing, yet whose personal life had been reduced to a series of carefully managed disappointments, including a marriage that ended the moment his net worth became public and relationships that felt more like negotiations than connections. And by the time he turned 52, Daniel had come to believe that the higher he climbed, the less real the people around him became, until even simple conversations felt transactional, measured, and filtered through expectation. And it was this growing sense of emotional isolation that led him to design something most people would never dare attempt, not because it was impossible, but because it required him to give up the one thing he had spent his entire life building, his identity. So when construction began on his newest corporate headquarters in Austin, Texas, Daniel made a decision that even his closest advisors questioned. He would enter his own company as an unknown employee, a janitor working the night shift, someone no one would notice, someone no one would try to impress, because he wasn't looking for admiration anymore. He was searching for something far more fragile, something that couldn't be bought or influenced, something that had to reveal itself naturally. And for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of anticipation, not for profit or expansion, but for a chance to observe life without the filter of wealth. And as irrational as it sounded, it also felt like the only honest way left for him to understand the people he was building his world around. But there was one problem he didn't account for, and her name was Emily Carter, a 38-year-old administrative coordinator who had joined the company during its early hearing phase, someone who didn't come from money, who had spent most of her life working 2 jobs, caring for her younger brother after their parents passed, and who viewed success not as luxury, but as stability. Someone who believed deeply in honesty because she had seen what happened when people pretended to be something they weren't. And from the very first night Daniel noticed her, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a simple experiment, because Emily didn't just treat him kindly, she treated him like he mattered, and in a place where most people moved quickly past anything that didn't benefit them, that alone made her impossible to ignore. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The first time they spoke, it was almost accidental. Daniel was emptying a trash bin near her desk when she looked up and thanked him, not casually but sincerely, the kind of thank you that made him pause, because it had been a long time since anyone spoke to him without expectation. And over the next few days, those small interactions grew into quiet conversations, brief exchanges about long work hours, about coffee, about life outside the office. And Daniel found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, listening without calculating what the other person wanted in return. Because Emily never asked him for anything, she didn't try to impress him. She didn't even seem particularly interested in him beyond simple human decency. And that was exactly what made her different, and exactly what made his secret more dangerous with every passing day. As weeks passed, Daniel began adjusting his schedule just to coincide with hers, staying longer during his shifts, finding reasons to be near her department, and slowly their conversation stretched beyond surface-level topics into something more personal. She spoke about the challenges of keeping up with bills, about the pressure of being the only support system for her brother, about her belief that people often hide their true selves behind status and titles. And every word she spoke felt like a quiet test that Daniel wasn't sure he was passing, because the deeper their connection grew, the more he realized that the truth he was hiding wasn't just a detail, it was everything. And revealing it wouldn't just change how she saw him, it would change how she understood every moment they had already shared. At the same time, the company itself was thriving. Executives praised the culture, productivity was rising, and Daniel observed it all from the background, hearing unfiltered opinions about leadership, about management decisions, even about himself, though no one knew he was listening. And while some employees speculated about the mysterious owner who rarely appeared in public, Emily remained uninterested in the speculation, often saying that it didn't matter who owned the company as long as people were treated fairly, a statement that stayed with Daniel longer than he expected, because for the first time, he wondered if revealing himself would actually destroy the very thing he was trying to build, not just with her, but within the entire environment he had carefully created. But not everything remained simple. As their interactions became more frequent, others in the office began to notice. Subtle comments turned into quiet judgment. Coworkers questioned why Emily spent time talking to the janitor. And while she brushed it off at first, the pressure slowly built, creating a tension that Daniel could see but not openly address, because stepping in would mean stepping out of the role he had committed to. And for the first time since starting this experiment, he began to feel the weight of his decision, not as a strategy, but as a risk that could hurt someone who had done nothing but treat him with kindness. And yet walking away now felt just as impossible as telling the truth. And then came the moment that shifted everything. One evening, as they sat near the break room after most employees had left, Emily shared something that Daniel couldn't ignore. She told him about a past relationship where she had been deceived by someone who pretended to be less successful than he actually was, someone who revealed his wealth only after gaining her trust, and how that experience left her feeling manipulated, not because of the money, but because of the dishonesty. And as she spoke, Daniel realized that the very test he believed would lead him to genuine love might be built on the same foundation that had already broken her trust once before. And in that moment, the question was no longer whether she would accept him for who he was, but whether she would forgive him for who he pretended to be, and whether he was already too far in to turn back. From that night forward, every interaction carried a different weight. Every word he chose felt heavier, more deliberate, as if one wrong sentence could unravel everything they had built so far, and Daniel began to notice small changes in himself. He was no longer just observing Emily. He was protecting her perception of him, shaping conversations carefully, avoiding topics that might expose inconsistencies. And in doing so, he crossed a line he hadn't originally intended to cross. Because what started as an experiment had quietly become something far more personal, something that now depended on maintaining a version of himself that wasn't entirely real. And the deeper he went, the harder it became to separate who he truly was from who she believed him to be. At the same time, Emily began to trust him more, not in the way one might trust a colleague, but in the way people trust someone they feel safe around, someone who listens without judgment, someone who exists outside the pressures of status and expectation. And she started sharing parts of her life that she rarely spoke about at work, stories about her childhood, about the sacrifices she made for her brother, about the quiet fear of never truly getting ahead no matter how hard she worked. And Daniel listened to all of it with a level of attention that surprised even himself, because for once, there was nothing to gain from the conversation except understanding, and yet that alone felt more valuable than anything his success had ever provided. For a brief moment, neither of them moved, as if both were waiting for reality to correct itself, for some explanation to surface that would make what she was seeing less absolute. but no such explanation came. And as the silence stretched, Emily's expression shifted from confusion into something more defined, something sharper, the kind of clarity that doesn't come from understanding, but from realization, and Daniel could see it happening in real time. The way her mind began to retrace every interaction they had shared, every conversation, every small moment that once felt genuine now being re-examined under a completely different light. And in that instant, he understood that the truth he had withheld wasn't just being revealed, it was rewriting everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that made it clear she wasn't asking a question out of curiosity, but out of necessity. She needed to hear him confirm what she already knew, not because it would change anything, but because hearing it would make it real. And Daniel, standing there without the disguise he had relied on for so long, realized that there was no version of the truth he could present that would soften what she was about to feel, so he didn't try to reshape it. He didn't attempt to justify it in that moment. He simply acknowledged it, and in doing so, he watched the final piece fall into place for her, the moment where uncertainty disappeared and was replaced by something far more difficult to navigate. Around them, the event continued. Conversations resumed. Laughter returned. But for the two of them, the room might as well have been empty, because the space between them had become the only thing that mattered. And Emily's next reaction wasn't loud or dramatic. It was controlled, measured in a way that suggested she was holding back far more than she was willing to show in that setting. And that restraint carried its own kind of intensity, because it meant she was processing everything internally, choosing not to react impulsively, choosing instead to step back, to create distance, and that decision alone told Daniel more than any confrontation could have. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him in front of the crowd. Instead, she asked one simple question, one that cut through everything else because of how direct it was. She asked him how long had he been pretending? And when he answered, when he gave her the full length of time, not a shortened version, not something adjusted to seem less severe, but the complete truth, he saw the impact of that honesty land in a way that was immediate and irreversible. Because it wasn't just the fact that he had hidden his identity, it was the duration, the length of time she had been unknowingly building trust with someone who wasn't presenting himself fully, and that detail changed the scale of everything. What followed wasn't anger in the way most people would expect. It was something quieter, something that settled in rather than erupted, and Emily took a step back, not dramatically, but deliberately, creating a physical space that mirrored the emotional distance forming between them. And in that moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, uncertainty without control. Because up until now, every aspect of this situation had been guided by his decisions, his planning, his structure, but this was different. This was entirely in her hands, and there was nothing he could do to influence what she chose to do next without making things worse. She told him she needed time, not as a way to delay a conversation, but as a boundary, a clear indication that she couldn't process everything in that moment. And without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, not rushing, not hesitating, just leaving with a sense of finality that didn't need to be stated out loud. And as Daniel watched her go, he realized that this was the first time since starting this experiment that he had no role to play, no identity to hide behind, no strategy to rely on. He was simply a man who had made a choice, and was now facing the consequences of it without any control over how it would unfold. In the days that followed, the absence of her presence became more noticeable than anything she had ever said, because where there had once been routine interactions, there was now silence. Where there had once been familiarity, there was now distance. And Daniel, returning to his role as the visible leader of the company, found that the clarity he once had in his professional life felt less significant compared to the uncertainty he now faced personally. Because success, in all its measurable forms, offered no guidance on how to repair something built on trust that had been compromised in a way that couldn't simply be explained away. Emily, on the other hand, didn't disappear immediately. She returned to work, maintained her responsibilities, but her interactions were different, more reserved, more focused, and she avoided any situation that might bring them into direct contact, not out of fear, but out of intention, because creating that space was part of how she processed what had happened. And for those observing from the outside, the change was subtle enough to go unnoticed. But for Daniel, it was unmistakable, because he knew what had been there before, and he could feel the absence of it in every moment they didn't share. At the same time, conversations within the company began to shift. Word of the founder's appearance at the event circulated, and while most employees focused on the significance of finally seeing the person behind the company, a few began connecting details, small observations that, when combined, started to form questions. And although no one had the full picture, the possibility that something unusual had been happening beneath the surface began to take shape, adding another layer of complexity to a situation that was already difficult enough without external attention. As the weeks progressed, Emily was formally offered the promotion she had been considered for, a role that would place her closer to the executive level, closer to Daniel's direct line of leadership. And while this opportunity represented everything she had worked toward, it also presented a choice that was no longer purely professional, because accepting it would mean existing within a space where avoiding him would no longer be possible. And declining it would mean walking away from something she had earned through her own effort. And that decision became a reflection of something larger, not just about her career, but about how she chose to move forward in a situation where trust had been altered in a way that couldn't be undone. For Daniel, watching her face that decision brought a realization that settled in slowly but firmly, that whatever happened next would not be defined by what he wanted or what he hoped for, but by what she chose. And for perhaps the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to have something truly important exist outside of his control, something that couldn't be influenced by resources, by position, or by strategy, and that understanding, while difficult, also carried a clarity he hadn't experienced before, because it stripped everything down to its simplest form, truth and consequence, and left him with nothing to rely on except the hope that what they had shared, even in its imperfect form, had meant enough to her to consider what might still be possible. And yet, even with that hope, there remained a question that neither of them could fully answer, not yet, not without time and distance, a question that lingered beneath every decision, every interaction, every silence, and it was a question that would ultimately determine whether this story would end as a lesson in caution or as something more complicated, something that didn't fit neatly into categories of right or wrong, because sometimes the most difficult truths are the ones that exist somewhere in between, where intention and impact don't align, and where understanding doesn't automatically lead to forgiveness. In the days following the promotion offer, Emily found herself caught in a quiet internal conflict that extended far beyond her career, because on the surface, the decision seemed straightforward, a recognition of her work, a step forward, an opportunity she had earned without shortcuts or influence. Yet beneath that surface was a reality she couldn't ignore. Accepting the role would place her in closer proximity to Daniel, not as the janitor she had come to know, but as the man who had chosen to hide behind that role. And every time she considered saying yes, she found herself revisiting the same question, not about the job itself, but about whether she could operate in that environment without constantly being reminded of the way trust had been introduced and then altered without her knowledge. Daniel, meanwhile, had resumed his position fully, stepping back into the responsibilities that once defined his daily life, meetings, decisions, strategic planning, all of it continuing as if nothing had changed. And yet everything felt different, because even as the company moved forward, his focus was no longer as sharp as it had been before. His attention divided between the demands of leadership and the unresolved situation that lingered just beneath the surface of his thoughts. And for the first time in years, he found himself questioning not his business decisions, but his personal ones, replaying conversations, reconsidering choices, and recognizing that the clarity he once relied on in every aspect of his life did not extend to this. When Emily finally made her decision, it wasn't announced publicly at first. It was communicated quietly, directly, and without unnecessary explanation. She declined the promotion, choosing to remain in her current role rather than step into a position that would require her to engage with Daniel on a level she wasn't ready to accept. And while her reasoning was framed professionally, focused on timing and readiness, the underlying truth was clear to him the moment he heard. Because it wasn't about capability, it was about distance, and that decision, while measured and controlled, carried a weight that neither of them needed to discuss to understand. The impact of that choice extended beyond their personal situation. It created subtle shifts within the company's internal dynamics, questions about why someone with her performance record would turn down advancement, speculation that remained mostly unspoken but present enough to influence perception. And although Emily continued to perform her duties with the same level of consistency, there was now an added layer to how she was viewed, not negatively, but with a sense of curiosity that she chose not to address, because explaining it would require revealing something she had no intention of sharing, and maintaining that boundary became part of how she moved forward. For Daniel, her decision clarified something he had been avoiding, that whatever connection they had built existed on terms that he had altered without her consent. And while his intention had been to find something genuine, the method he chose had introduced a condition that made that outcome uncertain from the start, and recognizing that didn't immediately provide a solution, but it did remove the illusion that he could somehow return things to the way they were. Because the version of their relationship that existed before the reveal was tied to a context that no longer existed, and accepting that became the first step in understanding what, if anything, could come next. Despite the distance between them, there came a moment when avoidance was no longer possible, a scheduled meeting that required Emily's department to present updates to senior leadership, including Daniel. And while the setting was professional, structured, and focused on work, the underlying tension was undeniable, not because of anything overt, but because of everything that remained unspoken, and as Emily presented her report, maintaining composure, delivering information clearly and confidently, Daniel observed not just the content of what she was saying, but the way she carried herself, the control, the focus, the deliberate separation between her professional role and the personal situation they had yet to resolve. When the meeting concluded, most of the room cleared quickly, conversations shifting to other matters, but for a brief moment, they found themselves in the same space without the buffer of structure or audience. And it was in that moment that Daniel chose to speak, not with a prepared explanation or a rehearsed justification, but with a level of directness that matched the situation, acknowledging that he understood why she had made the choices she did, not attempting to change her perspective, but simply recognizing it. And that approach, while not resolving anything, created a different kind of interaction, one that wasn't built on pretense or avoidance, but on a shared awareness of where they stood. Emily listened without interruption, her response measured, not dismissive, but not open in a way that suggested immediate reconciliation. Because for her, the issue was not just about understanding why he had done what he did. It was about the effect it had on how she perceived everything that followed, and she made that clear, explaining that while she didn't doubt that parts of their interactions had been real, the fact that they were built within a framework she didn't fully understand at the time made it difficult to separate what was genuine from what was influenced by the situation itself, and that distinction mattered to her in a way that couldn't be easily resolved through explanation alone. That conversation didn't end with a resolution. It ended with an acknowledgement, an understanding that moving forward would require time, not in the sense of waiting for emotions to fade, but in the sense of allowing new interactions to form without the same conditions that defined the past. And while that didn't guarantee any particular outcome, it did establish something that hadn't been present before, a foundation based on transparency rather than concealment, and for both of them. That represented a shift, subtle but significant, because it changed the nature of what was possible, even if it didn't immediately change how they felt. As time passed, their interactions began to reappear, not as frequently, not with the same ease as before, but gradually, in controlled, intentional ways, brief conversations that stayed within clear boundaries, exchanges that focused on the present rather than revisiting the past. And through those moments, a different kind of connection began to form, one that lacked the simplicity of what came before, but carried a level of honesty that hadn't existed then. And while it was uncertain where that would lead, it marked the beginning of something that wasn't defined by what had been hidden, but by what was now fully visible. At the same time, Daniel found himself approaching his role differently, not in terms of strategy or leadership, but in how he viewed the people within the company, because the experience of seeing the organization from the perspective of someone without authority had changed his understanding in ways that extended beyond his initial intentions. And while that had been part of the experiment, the personal outcome had given it a depth he hadn't anticipated. One that influenced not just how he managed the company, but how he approached relationships in general, recognizing that authenticity required more than observation. It required participation without control. And yet, even as progress was made, the question that had lingered from the beginning remained, not as a source of tension, but as an open possibility, something that neither of them could fully answer yet. Because what they were building now was different from what they had before, shaped by experience, by awareness, by the understanding that trust, once altered, doesn't return in the same form. It evolves. And whether that evolution would lead them back to each other in a meaningful way or simply allow them to move forward with clarity was something that could only be determined over time, through actions rather than intentions, through consistency rather than explanation. As the weeks turned into months, what had once been a situation defined by tension and uncertainty began to settle into something quieter, not necessarily easier, but more stable, because both Daniel and Emily had reached a point where the intensity of the initial revelation had given way to a more measured understanding of what they were dealing with. And in that space, their interactions continued to evolve, not dramatically, but in small, consistent ways that gradually reshaped the dynamic between them. And while neither of them openly acknowledged it, there was a growing recognition that whatever came next would not resemble what they had before. It would have to be built differently, with a level of awareness that neither of them had when this began. Daniel, for his part, made a conscious effort to remove any remaining imbalance that might influence how Emily experienced the environment around her, not through grand gestures or direct intervention in her career, but through broader changes that applied to everyone, reinforcing policies that emphasized transparency, accessibility, and fairness, ensuring that the company culture reflected the values he had come to understand more clearly during his time working anonymously. And while these changes were not framed as personal decisions, they carried a significance that extended beyond business strategy, because they represented a shift in how he approached leadership itself, moving away from distance and toward a form of engagement that prioritized trust over control. Emily noticed these changes, not immediately, but over time, as patterns began to form, as decisions aligned more consistently with principles she had always believed should guide an organization. And while she didn't attribute them directly to Daniel's experience, she understood that something had influenced the direction the company was taking, and that awareness created a subtle shift in how she viewed him, not as the person he had presented himself to be initially, but as someone capable of reflection and adjustment, someone who, despite the mistake he had made, was not fixed in that decision. And that distinction, while not resolving everything, made it possible for her to engage with him in a way that wasn't defined entirely by the past. Their conversations, when they occurred, remained grounded, focused on present realities rather than revisiting what had already been addressed. And in those moments, a different kind of connection began to take shape, one that wasn't built on simplicity or illusion, but on a shared understanding of complexity. And while it lacked the effortless ease of their earlier interactions, it carried something else, something more deliberate, more considered, and in some ways more real. Because it existed without the conditions that had previously shaped it, and that difference, while subtle, mattered. There came a point when the possibility of spending time together outside of work surfaced, not as a planned step, but as a natural extension of the conversations they had been having, and when it did, neither of them approached it lightly, because both understood what it represented, not a return to what had been, but the potential beginning of something new, something that would have to stand on its own without relying on the familiarity of the past. And after some hesitation, some consideration, they agreed, not with certainty, but with a willingness to see what would happen when the context that had once defined their interactions was removed entirely. That first meeting outside the structure of the workplace was different from anything they had experienced before, not because of the setting, which was simple and unremarkable, but because of the clarity that existed between them. There were no roles being played, no information being withheld, no assumptions left unexamined. And while that level of openness introduced its own kind of vulnerability, it also removed the ambiguity that had once complicated everything, allowing them to interact as two individuals without the layers that had previously separated them. And in that space, something began to take form, not quickly, not easily, but with a steadiness that suggested it was not dependent on circumstance. Even so, the past was not something that could be erased. It remained present, not as an obstacle, but as a reference point, something that informed how they approached each new interaction, how they communicated, how they set expectations, and in many ways, that awareness became a strength rather than a limitation, because it prevented them from falling into patterns that relied on assumption rather than understanding. And while it meant that progress was slower, more deliberate, it also meant that what they were building had a foundation that had been tested in a way neither of them had expected at the beginning. For Daniel, this experience reshaped his understanding of what it meant to connect with someone on a genuine level, because it required him to relinquish the control he had relied on for most of his life, to accept that authenticity could not be engineered or observed from a distance. It had to be lived, fully and without manipulation, and that realization extended beyond his relationship with Emily, influencing how he approached every interaction, every decision, creating a shift that was as personal as it was professional. For Emily, the process was different. It was not about learning to trust in general, but about learning to trust in a specific context where that trust had once been altered. And while she never ignored what had happened, she also didn't allow it to define every aspect of what came after, choosing instead to evaluate each moment on its own terms, to allow consistency and transparency to rebuild what had been changed, not by forgetting, but by observing, by experiencing, by allowing time to do what explanations alone could not. And so, as their story moved forward, it did so without a clear label, without a definitive conclusion that could be easily summarized, because what they had was not something that fit neatly into a single outcome. It was a process, ongoing, shaped by choices made in real time rather than predetermined expectations. And whether it would ultimately lead to something lasting or simply serve as a moment of growth for both of them was not something that needed to be answered immediately. Because sometimes the most honest ending is not one that resolves every question, but one that acknowledges that not all outcomes are meant to be certain, that some are meant to remain open, defined not by a final decision, but by the understanding that what matters most is how the story was lived, not how it was concluded.